Snow fell thick over the Ardennes, muting the gunfire that still echoed from the tree line. It was December 1944, and the 101st Evacuation Hospital outside Bastogne looked more like a frozen barn than a place of mercy. Inside, beneath flickering lanterns and the faint smell of ether, American medics moved through rows of stretchers where uniforms no longer mattered. Olive drab and field gray blended under the same wool blankets, both soaked the same dull brown. The men in white armbands had run out of everything: morphine, bandages, plasma, but the wounded kept coming. Truckloads of casualties arrived from the front, and among them were Germans, paratroopers from the 5th Fallschirmjäger, frostbitten, concussed, half delirious. No one had planned for this mixture of enemies in one ward, yet the Geneva Convention was clear, and so were the consciences of most medics. A wound was a wound. Private First Class Albert Reed knelt beside a German corporal whose leg had been mangled by shrapnel. The medic's gloved fingers trembled as he unrolled the last clean dressing he had, one he had been saving for his own sergeant. He hesitated only a second, then pressed it against the foreign uniform, binding the tourniquet tight. Around him, others did the same, stripping the paper labels off sulfa powder tins meant for American kits, sprinkling them over wounds that bore the black and silver eagle insignia. Outside, artillery thumped like a giant heartbeat. The line between enemy and patient blurred further with every explosion. The medics worked in shifts that never really ended. They cut bandages from bed sheets, boiled snow for water, used morphine syrettes twice by rinsing the needles in alcohol. They whispered prayers for the next supply convoy that might not get through. A captured German doctor, still wearing his Iron Cross ribbon, had been brought in to assist. Without discussion, he joined the line of stretchers, checking pulses, setting fractures, nodding silently to his former foes. In that drafty tent, rank and allegiance lost their hierarchy. Only pulse and breath counted. What none of them knew was how closely the battle's outcome hung on their endurance. Every minute spent keeping a man alive, American or German, meant fewer hands to dig, fewer rifles to fire. Yet something deeper than orders drove them. The medic's creed, unspoken but absolute, said that mercy was not a luxury of victory. It was proof of civilization itself. Still, as Reed tied off another dressing, he glanced at the dwindling stack of gauze and thought of the men outside freezing in foxholes with nothing but rags for their wounds. He wondered how long conscience could compete with necessity. The lantern sputtered, throwing shadows that made the tent walls pulse like lungs. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, another wave of wounded would soon arrive, more Americans, more Germans, indistinguishable beneath the snow and mud. The medics braced themselves for that next truckload, unaware that what they were about to face would test not their skill, but the very limits of their humanity. By dawn, the supply trucks still hadn't come. The road from Bastogne was under artillery fire, and the medics knew they might not see replacements for days. Inside the field hospital, the stench of blood, diesel fumes, and antiseptic clung to every breath. Snow leaked through the roof seams, melting into the bedding. Men groaned in English and German alike. The sound was universal, raw survival. Captain Harold Bennett, the senior medical officer, moved between cots with a clipboard so stained it was barely legible. He had memorized the order of triage long ago: red tags first, yellow after, black last. But when both friend and enemy shared the same color tags, priorities became harder to justify. He paused over a wounded German officer whose lung had collapsed from shell fragments. Next to him, an American private with a belly wound had already lost too much blood. Both needed the same bottle of plasma, only one remained. Bennett stared for several seconds, then handed the bottle to his orderly. "Give it to the boy," he said quietly, nodding toward the private. Then he looked back at the German, still gasping, and reached for his stethoscope anyway. He couldn't stop himself from trying. Around midday, the Germans began arriving in greater numbers. Most had frostbite so severe that their boots had fused to their feet. Medics cut them off carefully with pocket knives, the smell of gangrene filling the air. One captured stretcher-bearer, barely 18, tried to help his comrades until exhaustion dropped him to the floor. No one pushed him away. Instead, an American sergeant gave him a cup of weak coffee and told him to rest. Acts like that repeated silently all day, unrecorded, unseen, yet more powerful than any headline. Outside, near the tree line, the front shifted unpredictably. Sometimes the thunder of shells seemed distant. Other times, the earth shook as if the fight were at the tent's door. The medics kept their heads down and their hands steady. They had learned to ignore the whistle of incoming rounds, just as they ignored the insignia on the wounded. The Geneva Convention wasn't their shield. It was simply habit now, instinct forged by too many campaigns. Late that afternoon, a jeep finally arrived, its driver half frozen, the windshield shattered. It carried a crate of supplies salvaged from a wrecked convoy, 3 cases of bandages, 2 of sulfa, 1 of plasma. The relief lasted seconds. Then they realized the plasma had burst from the cold, frozen solid. The bandages were soaked in fuel. Only the sulfa could be saved. The medic sighed and went back to work, rinsing cloths in melted snow and rewrapping wounds that were already seeping through. When night fell again, the lanterns dimmed to conserve fuel. Somewhere outside, a German prisoner moaned for his mother. An American voice whispered comfort in broken phrases of high school German. They were enemies by definition, brothers by circumstance. And as the cold deepened, the medics understood that mercy, too, could freeze if they didn't keep it alive. The storm worsened through the night. Snow piled so high that the tent walls sagged inward, creaking under the weight. Inside, the medics moved slower now, their bodies numb from exhaustion. They hadn't slept more than an hour in 2 days. The kerosene lamps flickered weakly, throwing long shadows over the wounded men. Every movement echoed, the hiss of the sterilizer, the rip of cloth, the metallic click of a morphine syringe being emptied. At the far end of the ward, 2 Germans shared a stretcher meant for one. One had lost his leg, the other his eyesight. They clutched each other's hands without speaking. A few feet away, a young American corporal with shrapnel in his side stared at them, disbelief and anger mixing behind his eyes. He turned away, muttering something about helping the enemy. The medic treating him, Sergeant Paul Carver, didn't reply. He had heard the same words all week. He also knew that the Germans' blood, if typed correctly, could be used for transfusion. Supplies were that scarce, and in this place, blood didn't have nationality. Carver cleaned his instruments in a bucket of near-freezing water. His gloves had holes in the fingertips. Each time he reached for a dressing, he thought about the irony. The same bandages wrapped around German limbs were the ones he'd rationed from their dwindling stockpile, meant originally for Americans still fighting in the forest. But when a man bled, ideology dissolved faster than morphine. He remembered something Bennett had said 2 days earlier, almost to himself, while wiping his hands after a surgery. If I start deciding who deserves to live, I'm not a medic anymore. Outside, distant gunfire rolled across the snowfields, then faded. Word spread that a nearby unit of the 506th Parachute Infantry had been cut off. Dozens more wounded were expected by morning. The medics knew the numbers didn't add up. There weren't enough blankets, stretchers, or antiseptics left. Still, they prepared another row of cots, clearing space beside the Germans who already filled the ward. When new patients arrived, no one would be turned away. In the early hours before dawn, an explosion rattled the entire compound. A shell landed just beyond the supply tent, throwing shards of metal into the air. One pierced the roof, tearing through a lantern. The fire that followed burned out in minutes, smothered by snow, but the damage was done, half their stored medical rations gone. Carver stood in the cold, watching the smoke curl upward, wondering how much longer they could sustain this strange moral war within a larger one. Inside again, he found the German doctor sitting beside an unconscious American pilot, adjusting the man's oxygen flow. The scene struck him. The enemy physician, sleeves rolled up, face gray with fatigue, performing his duty as if it mattered who was watching. In that moment, Carver realized the battlefield's real front line wasn't marked by trenches or maps. It ran straight through the human heart. Morning came pale and bitter, with the sound of engines groaning somewhere beyond the trees. It wasn't reinforcements, only another convoy of wounded. Jeeps and half-tracks arrived half buried in snow, headlights dimmed to slits. The medics waded through the drifts, pulling stretchers from the trucks, some men still breathing, others long since still. A few of the wounded wore American uniforms dusted white, others wore field gray mottled with blood. None had boots worth salvaging. Frostbite had chewed their toes to bone. The field hospital overflowed. Triage spilled into the open snow, where the dead lay lined in rows under tarps. Bennett ordered the least injured to help the worst, regardless of side. The German stretcher-bearer from the night before limped between cots, carrying water in his dented helmet. An American nurse, her voice gone hoarse, shouted for morphine that didn't exist. Men begged for warmth more than pain relief. They burned anything they could, splintered crates, broken stretchers, even splints, to keep the lamps alive. Carver moved between the cots with mechanical rhythm, changing dressings, injecting sulfa, wrapping the same strips of cloth again and again after rinsing them in snowmelt. He had stopped feeling hunger or fatigue. When a lieutenant told him they'd received word from command that the next supply drop might not come for another 48 hours, he just nodded. It didn't matter anymore. The work would continue until it couldn't. At noon, something unexpected happened. Group of captured German medics, taken the day before, requested to assist. They were allowed under guard. Soon they joined the Americans at the operating tables, working with the same quiet intensity. One of them, a middle-aged sergeant named Kerhler, had been a medic since Poland in '39. His hands didn't tremble even as he stitched an American's abdominal wound with thread salvaged from a sewing kit. "Krieg ist dumm," he muttered once, barely audible. "War is stupid." No one disagreed. The cooperation spread naturally. A young American orderly found himself holding retractors while a German medic sutured. Another German helped splint the arm of a black infantryman from the 333rd Battalion, speaking halting English to calm him. For a few surreal hours, enemies worked side by side, the tent filled not with hatred, but with the steady rhythm of shared necessity. Late that afternoon, the shelling stopped for the first time in days. A silence settled over the forest so complete it seemed unnatural. The medics stepped outside, blinking against the snow glare. Smoke curled from distant trees, rising like gray ribbons. Somewhere up the line, artillery crews reloaded, preparing for the next barrage. Inside the tent, the men, American and German, kept working, their breath fogging in the cold. They knew the stillness wouldn't last. But for a brief, fragile moment, they had created something the battlefield could not destroy. A fragile truce made not by treaties, but by hands and bandages. By evening, the temperature had fallen below freezing. Breath turned to frost inside the tent, coating the lantern glass with a film of ice. The men spoke less now. Even small talk cost energy they didn't have. Every sound was muted, gauze unrolling, a scissor's metallic snap, boots shifting on frozen ground. Beyond the perimeter, artillery flares briefly painted the sky red and white, then vanished into darkness. Bennett studied his ledger again, though there was little left to record. Supply lines were shattered, communications unreliable, yet he kept writing because any order, was a form of defiance. He noted every bottle of iodine, every strip of morphine, every usable instrument. His handwriting trembled more from fatigue than cold. He had once imagined medicine as precision, now it felt like endurance. A sudden commotion near the entrance drew his attention. Two stretcher teams pushed through the flaps carrying a wounded American and a German officer, both hit by the same shell, both unconscious. Their bodies were tangled in the same torn blanket. Carver moved quickly, cutting away cloth, assessing wounds. The German's pulse was weak but steady. The American's chest barely moved. The operating table had room for one. Bennett hesitated just long enough for the moment to burn itself into memory. Then he ordered the German officer moved aside, his wound temporarily dressed, while the American was lifted onto the table. No one argued, but the air thickened with unspoken weight. The German medic Köhler quietly adjusted the officer's bandages, murmuring prayers under his breath. When Carver glanced at him, their eyes met for a second, two exhausted men, caught in an equation neither had written. War demanded division, their work kept erasing it. Hours passed, the American didn't survive. When Bennett finally stepped back, face gray with strain, the German officer was still alive. Carver crossed over without being told and began surgery on him next. There was no triumph in it, only the dull continuation of duty. Blood was blood, stopping it felt like the only rebellion left. Outside, the wind had shifted. Snow drifted sideways through torn seams in the canvas. Someone began stacking the bodies near the perimeter wall, American and German together, because separation no longer mattered. The line between saving and losing had blurred too far to measure. Near midnight, a distant rumble echoed down the valley, engines, hundreds of them. Some thought it was another German armored thrust, others prayed it was Patton's Third Army breaking through. The medics worked in silence, too numb for hope or fear. When Bennett finally stepped outside, the horizon flickered with headlights. Relief was coming. He turned back toward the tent, where Carver and Köhler leaned over the German officer's still form, both unaware that the front itself was about to move past them. In the next few hours, the war around them would shift again, but inside that frozen hospital, humanity had already drawn its own front line. The first tanks of Patton's relief column reached Bastogne before dawn. Their engines cut through the cold air like a promise, their headlights slicing through the blizzard. Soldiers stumbled out of the darkness carrying crates of supplies, bandages, morphine, blood plasma frozen solid but salvageable once thawed. For the medics who had survived on scraps and willpower, the sound of engines was almost holy. Bennett stood outside the tent, his face raw from the wind, and watched the column snake through the trees. Ambulances followed close behind, their Red Cross symbols covered with mud. He felt something close to relief, but not quite. There was no celebration here, just a quiet exhale of exhaustion. The reinforcements brought food, fuel, and a rotation of fresh medical personnel. Yet when they entered the tent and saw the mix of American and German wounded lying side by side, their expressions froze. "You treated them?" one young lieutenant asked. Bennett only nodded. "We treated whoever was still breathing." The officer didn't reply. He simply moved on, his boots crunching over straw frozen to the floor. Inside, Carver was already working again. The new supplies had arrived too late for many, but it meant that others, American and German alike, might yet live. Köhler, the German medic, assisted him silently, translating murmured words from one cot to the next. The two worked in rhythm, communicating through nods, gestures, and shared fatigue. Around them, the moans had quieted. The worst was over. The war beyond the trees was not. Later that morning, an American chaplain entered with orders to separate the prisoners. Guards began tagging the Germans for transport to a rear holding camp. Some protested weakly, others simply stared at the ground. One young German with his arm in a sling stopped beside Carver. "Dank," he said softly. Carver looked up, managed a faint nod, then turned back to his instruments. He wasn't sure what to feel. Outside, the snow had turned to a pale mist. The rows of bodies were being loaded into trucks, both flags draped with the same frozen tarps. The relief units moved efficiently, their voices clipped, professional. Bennett oversaw the transfer, his clipboard once again filled with lists, this time of the dead. He didn't look at the names. As the last prisoners were taken away, Köhler approached him, asking in halting English what would happen to the field hospital. "We move forward," Bennett said. "There's always another front." Köhler nodded, then extended his hand, a gesture as quiet as it was profound. Bennett took it. When night returned, the medics gathered what little strength they had and prepared to move again. The war would continue for months, but this chapter, this frozen pocket of mercy in a landscape built for death, would linger in their memories long after. They would remember the cold, the blood, and the strange peace of saving lives that by every rule of war should have been left to die. When spring came to the Ardennes, the snow melted and revealed everything it had hidden: shell casings, ration tins, helmets, and shallow graves. The forest that had once roared with artillery now echoed with nothing but crows and wind. The old field hospital was gone, its canvas burned for warmth months earlier, but the stories lingered in the surviving medics' minds like half-remembered dreams. In the war's aftermath, Captain Harold Bennett returned to his civilian hospital in Illinois. Patients there came in with farm injuries and factory burns, yet his hands still trembled the same way they had in that frozen tent. He never spoke much about Bastogne. When asked, he'd simply say, "We did what we could." But in the quiet hours of night, he sometimes saw those rows of stretchers again, the Germans and Americans side by side, and wondered if that was the truest victory of all. Sergeant Paul Carver stayed in the Army until 1946, helping with prisoner repatriation in Europe. Once, while escorting a group of German POWs back to their homeland, he recognized one of them, the same young man who had said "Dank" in that tent. They exchanged no words, only a nod of recognition. Carver later wrote in his diary, "It's strange what the war taught us. We learned how to take life, but also how not to." As for Köhler, the German medic was released from captivity in 1947 and returned to Cologne, where he reopened a small clinic. Among the few personal items he kept from the war was a torn fragment of a U.S. field dressing with faded bloodstains on it, one of the same bandages used in that makeshift hospital. When his son asked why he kept it, Köhler answered simply, "Because it reminds me that even in war, someone cared." In the official histories, the Battle of the Bulge was remembered for its tanks, its snow, and its staggering losses. But in the unofficial history, the human one, it was also remembered for that tent on the edge of Bastogne, where medics on both sides proved that compassion could survive even in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. The war ended, but the memory of those shared bandages did not.